In presenting my summer assignment, I used the blanket term communication to describe my thesis topic. Martin was quick to point out, communication about what? Which quickly sent me into a panic because honestly I had no idea. The 1-week timeline of microthesis was a great way to get me to focus. I quickly chose type as my topic and decided to begin with an idea that stemmed from a lecture I'd seen in March of this year. Graphic and type designer Marta Bernstein proposed the idea that display typefaces embrace the spirit of their time. That idea intrigued me, the notion that a display typeface is not a trend, but a timestamp of a moment. I wanted to see how far I could push that idea. Could I generate a letter form whose shape is determined by a live external factor? I began my exploration by modifying code in P5.js to generate this speculative idea that suggests how, if fed with an outside data source, the dots that make up the letter A would scatter as the real-time temperature rises. While this idea was fun, I wanted to translate the concept into something physical that I could make with my hands. In keeping with the weather and time vein, I began to think about how a sundial's casted shadow conveys time. I decided to create a similar experience using studio lighting. The stretched and misshapen letter forms were just barely recognizable. They reminded me of a process I'd begun experimenting with last spring on the scanner. The scanner, I realized, could be a great lens to look at this experiment through. Raw analog distortion captured by a digital mechanism. I printed out the letter A on a piece of paper and started playing with it. In retrospect, I could and should have spent more time exploring these results, but in reality, after watching the scans play back, I began to wonder how I could make these letter forms transform seamlessly from one shape to the next. In a blind attempt to visually illustrate this concept, I jumped into After Effects and created this vector-based representation of 2 of the scanned letter forms. In looking back at these experiments, 2 elements stuck out to me. I missed the analog character of the original letter forms, the shadows in the light experiments, and the texture of paper and ink in the scanned version. I was also curious about legibility and boundaries in the forms I had created. At what point does an A stop being an A? I consciously carried both these ideas with me into the next project. I first began by sharing the Pinwheel with my parents and asking their reactions. Even though they both own and use Apple products, they had no idea what it was. This made me realize how used to seeing objects and icons I am. They're part of my everyday life and something that I take for granted. I started looking into the history of icon design and came across a lecture by Susan Carr, the first pixel artist at Apple. Many of the icons she designed while at Apple are still in use today, in part because of their simplicity. They were all designed on a 32 by 32 pixel grid. I decided to take a similar approach and break down the Pinwheel to its most basic components, pixels. I zoom into the Pinwheel until it becomes a solid grid. I share these images with my thesis advisors, and similar to my last project, Martin brings up a question. At what point can you no longer tell it's a pixel? I zoom in closer so the pixels become solid blocks of color. I began to think about how I might translate this series, this process, to 3D. I decide on a literal translation of the icon and build a physical Pinwheel. Unfortunately, the constructed Pinwheel lasted about 2 minutes. I was impatient and wanted to test it, and it broke apart in my hands. Rather than reconstruct a new one, I realized that, much like the digital version, this broken Pinwheel was still an object. When I share some of these initial phone images with my classmates, I explain how I want to crop in on certain areas. They encourage me to do so digitally and even suggest I try pixelating them. I realized by looking over the final images that I view them as a series. The end result is seen here, the Pinwheel conversation. This has been my side project for the past 3 weeks, the window in my studio. It's 8 feet long and almost 5 feet off the ground. Because of the height, I don't see anything more than swaying tree branches when I'm in the room. There's a long and winding ramp that passes directly under the window, allowing me to overhear conversations of those coming and going without really meaning to. I began my investigation by recording several hours worth of audio of those coming and going on the ramp, then auto-transcribing the audio to text. Out of 6 hours, only a few sentences were clear enough to be transcribed, but even then, some of the language had gotten lost in the translation process. "Don't forget to order your masks" became "Don't forget to order your magic." The idea of translation stuck with me. What was gained and what was lost in this process? I'd already translated my original audio once, but how could I do it in a visual way? How could I break it down? At this point, I need to get off the computer and start making with my hands. I go to my studio, but am at a loss for where to start. I decide to procrastinate instead and assemble a utility cart I purchased from IKEA. As I start to build the cart, I begin to realize how the pictorial instructions I'm following are a visual translation of the assembly process. I decide to grab my camera and document the individual pieces of the utility cart. I print out 50 images and attempt to visually collage them. I would normally attach them directly to the wall, but my studio was getting painted last week, so I decided to assemble them on cardboard instead. I placed the cardboard on the wall vertically before realizing it was roughly the same size and shape as my window. I place it on the opposite wall and start assembling. After sharing this in class, I'm encouraged to bring more of the window element back in. I translate the image collage from the cardboard to the window. There is a clear division between the two different images, bringing to attention a general feeling of discord. I shared these images with a classmate who suggested I try bringing them together digitally so that they're both in focus. Doing this, and translating them to black and white, suggested an even broader tension between the images, making them even more unsettling. After a discussion with my thesis advisors, I began to understand that what I initially thought of as a simple juxtaposition between my IKEA cart and the trees outside my window are actually suggestive of a much larger concept: the merging and conflict between two systems, or the constant reverberation between interior and exterior language. I'll continue to work on this imagery with these thoughts in mind beyond the deadline of this project. Thank you.